The morning air hung thick with the promise of another sweltering day in the city, and Elena Hartwell found herself standing at the precipice of what she could only describe as the most mortifying moment of her 26 years upon this earth. The coffee shop, with its pretentious exposed brick walls and artisanal everything, buzzed with the conversations of those who possessed both the leisure and the means to spend $14 on a single cup of what was, in essence, merely hot water filtered through ground beans. She had not intended to be there at all. Indeed, her presence was born of necessity rather than choice, for her ancient laptop had finally surrendered to the inevitable march of technological obsolescence, and she required the establishment's wireless connection to submit the final draft of her thesis on sustainable urban development. The thesis itself represented 3 years of painstaking research, countless sleepless nights, and the gradual erosion of what little savings she had managed to accumulate during her graduate studies. Elena had always possessed what her late grandmother had termed an unfortunate tendency toward righteousness, a trait that served her well in academic discourse, but proved rather less advantageous in the practical matters of daily existence. It was this very righteousness that had led her to pursue a degree in urban planning, driven by an almost quixotic belief that she might somehow contribute to the creation of more equitable cities. On this particular morning, however, righteousness had been overshadowed by desperation. Her thesis defense was scheduled for the following week, and she had discovered, to her horror, that the final version contained a formatting error that threatened to undermine months of work. The university's computer lab was closed for maintenance. Her roommate Sarah had departed for a weekend retreat with her insufferably wealthy boyfriend, and Elena's own laptop had chosen this moment to emit what could only be described as a death rattle before displaying nothing but a blank screen. Thus, she found herself in Grind Coffee Co., nursing a single cup of their least expensive offering, a house blend that, despite its modest price, still represented a significant portion of her weekly food budget. She had positioned herself at a small table near the window, her papers spread before her like the components of some elaborate ritual when fate chose to intervene in the form of a collision that would alter the trajectory of her existence. The collision itself was unremarkable in its mechanics. A tall figure in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, his attention absorbed by the glowing screen of what appeared to be an extraordinarily expensive smartphone, failed to observe Elena's careful arrangement of research materials. The subsequent contact between his Italian leather shoe and her table leg sent her laptop computer, already precariously balanced, tumbling toward the unforgiving tile floor below. Time, as it often does in moments of crisis, seemed to elongate. Elena watched with the peculiar detachment that accompanies shock as her 3 years of work transformed into a cascade of plastic and metal fragments. The laptop struck the floor with a sound that seemed to reverberate through her very soul. A sound that spoke of broken dreams and shattered aspirations, of student loans that would never be repaid, and a future that had just become infinitely more uncertain. The man in the suit, tall, with features that suggested both privilege and the comfortable assumption that such privilege was his natural birthright, looked down at the destruction with what appeared to be mild irritation rather than concern. His hair, Elena noted with the clarity that sometimes accompanies emotional extremity, was the color of dark honey, perfectly styled in a manner that spoke of expensive salons and regular maintenance. His jaw possessed the kind of strong lines that suggested good breeding and better nutrition, while his eyes, a startling shade of gray, regarded the scene with the sort of detached assessment one might employ when observing an interesting but ultimately inconsequential phenomenon. "Well," he said, his voice carrying the polished tones of private schools and Ivy League educations, "that's unfortunate." The word unfortunate seemed to hang in the air between them like a challenge. Elena felt something within her chest, something that had been carefully contained by years of financial stress and social conditioning, begin to expand and heat. This man, with his $1,000 shoes and casual dismissal of what represented her entire academic career, had just reduced the destruction of her life's work to a minor inconvenience. "Unfortunate," she repeated, rising from her chair with a movement that seemed to surprise them both. "Unfortunate is missing your train. Unfortunate is running out of milk. This," she gestured toward the remnants of her laptop, "this is catastrophic." He raised an eyebrow, a gesture that managed to convey both amusement and condescension in equal measure. "I'm sure insurance will cover." "Insurance." The word escaped her lips as something between a laugh and a scream. "Insurance? Do you think I have insurance for a 7-year-old laptop held together with electrical tape and prayer? Do you think I have the luxury of insuring things that I can barely afford to own in the first place?" The coffee shop had grown quiet around them, the usual morning chatter subsiding as other patrons turned their attention toward the unfolding drama. Elena was dimly aware of becoming a spectacle, but the realization only served to fuel the fire that had begun to burn within her chest. "Listen," the man said, reaching into his jacket with the casual ease of someone accustomed to solving problems with financial resources. "I can write you a check." "A check?" Eleanor's voice rose to a pitch that would have embarrassed her under any other circumstances. "You think you can just write a check and make this disappear?" That laptop contained 3 years of research, 3 years of interviews with community leaders, surveys of residents in low-income housing developments, analysis of zoning regulations that I spent months learning to navigate. You can't write a check for the nights I stayed awake until dawn, trying to make sense of municipal budgets and environmental impact reports. The man's expression shifted slightly, the casual dismissal replaced by something that might have been surprise. It occurred to Elena that he was perhaps unaccustomed to being addressed in such a manner, that his wealth had insulated him from the sort of raw emotion she was currently displaying. "Furthermore," she continued, her voice gaining momentum like a train gathering speed, "that thesis represents my only hope of earning a degree that might allow me to contribute something meaningful to this world. While you're standing there in your custom-tailored suit, probably worth more than I spend on rent in 6 months, deciding whether the destruction of someone else's dreams warrants the minor inconvenience of reaching for your checkbook, there are families in this city living in substandard housing because people like you treat everything and everyone as just another problem to be solved with money." The coffee shop had grown completely silent now, the morning rush suspended in fascination as Elena unleashed years of accumulated frustration upon this unfortunate representative of everything she had come to resent about inequality and privilege. "You walk through the world assuming that your wealth gives you the right to be careless," she pressed on, her academic training lending structure to her anger. "You bump into someone's table, destroy their work, their hopes, their future, and your first instinct is to reach for your wallet, because you've never had to consider that some things, some losses, cannot be purchased back into existence. You inhabit a reality where every problem has a price tag, where every mistake can be erased with the correct denomination of currency." The man opened his mouth as if to speak, but Elena was far from finished. "And the most infuriating part," she said, her voice dropping to a tone that somehow carried more weight than her previous outburst, "is that you'll walk away from this encounter and forget it happened within the hour. You'll tell someone at your office about the crazy woman who screamed at you in a coffee shop, and they'll all have a good laugh about it over lunch at whatever restaurant charges $50 for a salad. Meanwhile, I'll be explaining to my advisor why my thesis defense needs to be postponed, begging the university for an extension I probably won't receive, and trying to figure out how to recreate 3 years of work with no resources and no time." The silence that followed her words was profound. Elena stood there breathing heavily, suddenly aware that every person in the establishment was staring at her. The man in the expensive suit regarded her with an expression she could not quite decipher. It was neither the anger she might have expected, nor the dismissiveness she had become accustomed to receiving from those of his evident social class. Instead, his grey eyes held something that looked almost like curiosity, as if she had presented him with a puzzle he had not encountered before and was not entirely certain how to solve. "Miss," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, "I think you may have misunderstood." "Oh, I understand perfectly," Elena interrupted, gathering her scattered papers with hands that trembled slightly from the adrenaline still coursing through her system. "I understand that you've never had to worry about the cost of anything, including the consequences of your actions. I understand that you see people like me as background noise in your charmed existence. And I understand that this conversation is pointless because we inhabit entirely different worlds." She had begun stuffing her papers into her worn canvas bag when she heard a new voice. A woman's voice, cultured and carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. James Alexander Worthington, the man in the suit, James apparently, turned toward the speaker with an expression that Elena could only describe as resigned dread. The woman approaching their table was perhaps 60 years old, impeccably dressed in a way that suggested both substantial wealth and excellent taste. Her silver hair was styled in an elegant chignon, and her posture spoke of finishing schools and cotillion balls. But it was her eyes, the same striking grey as James's, that commanded attention, for they held an expression of profound disapproval directed entirely at her apparent offspring. "Mother," James said, the single word carrying volumes of explanation and apology. "Don't you mother me," the woman replied, her voice carrying the sort of crisp authority that Elena associated with headmistresses of exclusive boarding schools. "I witnessed that entire exchange, and I am appalled by your behavior." Elena, clutching her bag to her chest like a shield, found herself caught between the desire to flee and a fascination with watching James receive what appeared to be a public dressing down from his formidable parent. "Mrs. Worthington," James began, but his mother silenced him with a look that could have frozen running water. "This young woman," she said, gesturing toward Elena with a graceful hand adorned with what were undoubtedly genuine pearls, "has just delivered the most articulate and passionate defense of personal responsibility I have heard in decades, and you stand there looking as if she's speaking a foreign language." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as the woman's attention turned to her. "My dear," Mrs. Worthington continued, "please don't allow my son's appalling lack of manners to reflect poorly on his upbringing, though I'm beginning to wonder if perhaps I failed somewhere in the process. That is," Elena stammered, finding herself at a complete loss for words. The righteous anger that had carried her through her confrontation with James seemed to have abandoned her entirely in the face of his mother's unexpected support. "Nonsense," Mrs. Worthington said briskly. "You expressed yourself beautifully. James, I trust you intend to make this right?" James, who had been observing this exchange with an expression of growing bewilderment, seemed to realize that a response was expected. "Of course, Mother. I was trying to explain that I would be happy to replace the laptop and cover the cost of data recovery, and compensate for any professional delays, and arrange for temporary equipment while the situation is resolved," his mother finished smoothly. "The bare minimum of what any decent person would do after causing such disruption." Eleanor found herself staring at this unexpected alliance. I appreciate the gesture, but I couldn't possibly accept." "My dear child," Mrs. Worthington interrupted, her tone gentling considerably, "pride is a luxury you cannot afford at the moment. My son has caused you significant hardship through his carelessness. Accepting his assistance in rectifying the situation is not charity, it is justice." The older woman turned back to James with an expression that somehow managed to convey both maternal affection and profound disappointment. "I raised you to be better than this," she said quietly. "Your father and I have given you every advantage, every opportunity to develop into a man of character and compassion. Standing in a coffee shop, treating someone's very real distress as a minor inconvenience to be solved with a quick payment is not the behavior of the son I thought I had raised. James's jaw tightened, and Elena caught a glimpse of something, perhaps defensiveness, perhaps shame, flickering across his features. "Mother, you don't understand the situation." "I understand perfectly," Mrs. Worthington replied. "I understand that you were not paying attention to your surroundings. I understand that your carelessness resulted in damage to this young woman's property and significant disruption to her academic work. And I understand that your immediate response was to treat her distress as something that could be quickly resolved with money, rather than acknowledging the real impact of your actions." She paused, studying her son's face with the sort of penetrating gaze that Elena imagined could extract confessions from the most hardened criminals. "What I don't understand," she continued, "is when you became the sort of person who walks through the world assuming that wealth absolves you of the need for basic courtesy and consideration." The silence that followed this pronouncement was perhaps even more profound than the one that had greeted Elena's initial outburst. Around them, the coffee shop had begun to return to its normal rhythm, but Elena remained frozen in place, clutching her bag and trying to process the surreal nature of the situation in which she found herself. It was Mrs. Worthington who broke the silence, turning to Elena with a smile that transformed her entire countenance. "My dear, I don't believe we've been properly introduced. I am Margaret Worthington, and this is my son James, who is going to spend the remainder of this morning ensuring that every aspect of this situation is resolved to your complete satisfaction." Eleanor looked between mother and son, noting the way James's expression had shifted from defensive to something approaching resignation. "Elena Hartwell," she managed, extending her hand somewhat tentatively. "Elena," Mrs. Worthington repeated, as if testing the sound of the name. "A lovely name. And you mentioned a thesis? In what field?" "Urban planning," Elena replied, still feeling as if she were participating in someone else's conversation. "Specifically, sustainable development strategies for low-income communities." Something in Mrs. Worthington's expression shifted, a look of genuine interest replacing the polite social smile she had been wearing. How fascinating and noble. "The world has great need of young people with both the intelligence and the moral conviction to tackle such challenges." She turned back to James, who had been listening to this exchange with an expression Elena could not quite interpret. "James, I believe you mentioned that Worthington Development has been seeking consultation on that affordable housing project downtown. Perhaps Miss Hartwell's expertise might prove valuable." Eleanor felt her breath catch. Worthington Development. She recognized the name from her research, one of the most influential real estate development companies in the city, the sort of organization that typically viewed affordable housing requirements as obstacles to be minimized rather than opportunities to be embraced. "Mother," James said, his tone carrying a note of warning, I think, Mrs. Worthington interrupted, her voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the polished courtesy, "that this could be an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate that the Worthington family name still stands for something meaningful in this community." She returned her attention to Elena, who was beginning to feel as if she had inadvertently stepped into someone else's family drama. "Miss Hartwell, would you be interested in discussing your research over lunch? I confess I'm quite curious to hear more about your work on sustainable development." Elena glanced between mother and son, noting the complex interplay of emotions flickering across James's features. There was something happening here that went far beyond the simple matter of a broken laptop, some deeper current of family dynamics and expectations that she could sense but not fully understand. Yes, she heard herself saying, though she was not entirely certain why. "Yes, I would like that very much." Mrs. Worthington's smile widened, and Elena caught a glimpse of the formidable intelligence that undoubtedly lay beneath the woman's elegant exterior. "Excellent, James. I trust you can arrange for Miss Hartwell's computer situation to be resolved immediately, and I do mean immediately." James nodded, pulling out his phone with the sort of resigned efficiency that suggested he was accustomed to fulfilling his mother's directives, however unexpected they might be. "I'll have a replacement laptop delivered within the hour, along with a technician to attempt data recovery from the damaged drive. And backup equipment," Mrs. Worthington added smoothly, "in case the recovery process takes time." "Of course," James replied, his fingers moving quickly across the phone screen. Elena watched this exchange with a growing sense of unreality. An hour ago, she had been desperately trying to format her thesis. Now, she found herself the unexpected beneficiary of resources she could never have imagined having access to, offered by a woman who had appeared, seemingly from nowhere, to champion her cause. "Mrs. Worthington," she began, uncertain how to voice the questions swirling through her mind. "I'm not sure I understand why you're being so kind to me." The older woman's expression softened, and for a moment, Elena glimpsed something almost vulnerable beneath the composed exterior. "My dear, I have spent a great deal of time in recent years wondering what sort of legacy my family will leave in this world. My husband built Worthington Development into one of the most successful companies in the region, and James will inherit that success. But success without purpose, wealth without responsibility, privilege without compassion, these things create nothing of lasting value." She glanced at her son, who had finished his phone calls and was watching their conversation with an expression Eleanor still could not decipher. "Your passion for justice, your commitment to serving those who have been underserved, your willingness to speak truth regardless of the consequences, these qualities have become distressingly rare in our circles. I find myself wondering what might happen if someone with your convictions had access to the resources necessary to implement real change." Elena felt her pulse quicken. There was something in Mrs. Worthington's tone that suggested this conversation was heading somewhere far more significant than lunch and laptop replacement. "I'm not sure I follow." Mrs. Worthington exchanged a look with her son, a look laden with meaning that Elena could sense but not interpret. "Perhaps we should continue this discussion somewhere more private," she suggested. "James, you'll join us for lunch, of course." It was not phrased as a question, and James seemed to recognize this. "Of course, Mother." As they prepared to leave the coffee shop, Elena found herself caught in a strange suspension of disbelief. The morning had begun with disaster and desperation, had escalated into public confrontation, and was now somehow transforming into something that felt almost like opportunity. She could not shake the feeling that she was being swept along by currents far more powerful than she understood, guided by a woman whose motives remained beautifully, mysteriously opaque. The last thing she noticed as they exited the coffee shop was the way James held the door for her, a gesture that seemed automatic, bred into him by years of social conditioning, but which was performed with a thoughtfulness that had been absent during their initial encounter. When she thanked him, he met her eyes directly for the first time, and she was struck by the complexity of the emotions she glimpsed there. Embarrassment, certainly, but also something that looked almost like curiosity, as if she, like his mother, had presented him with a puzzle he had not expected to encounter, and was not entirely certain he was prepared to solve. The restaurant to which Mrs. Worthington led them was precisely the sort of establishment Eleanor had imagined when she spoke of $50 salads, an oasis of understated luxury where the absence of price listings on the menu served as an elegant reminder that if one needed to inquire about cost, one did not belong. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over tables dressed in starched white linen, while uniformed waitstaff moved with the practiced silence of those trained to anticipate needs before they were expressed. Elena felt acutely conscious of her worn jeans and second-hand blazer as they were escorted to a corner table that seemed to have been reserved in advance, though she could not recall Mrs. Worthington making any telephone calls. James had maintained an almost complete silence during their brief journey in his mother's chauffeur-driven car, a vehicle that managed to suggest both substantial wealth and refined taste without descending into ostentatious display. Elena had found herself seated between mother and son, acutely aware of the tension that seemed to emanate from James like heat from a radiator. His mother, by contrast, had filled the journey with gracious inquiries about Elena's background, her studies, her aspirations, all delivered with the sort of genuine interest that suggested she possessed both the intelligence to understand the responses and the empathy to appreciate their significance. Now, as they settled into their seats and Elena attempted to decipher a menu written in what appeared to be a mixture of French and pretension, she found herself wondering once again how a morning that had begun with academic catastrophe had led to this surreal luncheon engagement. Mrs. Worthington had ordered wine, a bottle whose vintage suggested it was older than Elena herself, without consulting her companions, a gesture that spoke to both her authority and her certainty that her choices would prove acceptable. "Elena, dear," Mrs. Worthington began, once the sommelier had completed his elaborate ritual of cork presentation and tasting, "I confess I have been thinking about our conversation in the coffee shop, and I find myself increasingly intrigued by your research. Sustainable development for low-income communities represents exactly the sort of challenge that requires both innovative thinking and moral courage." Elena accepted her wine glass with hands that trembled slightly. Whether from nervousness or from the lingering effects of her earlier adrenaline surge, she could not say. "Thank you. It's been challenging work. Most development companies see affordable housing requirements as obstacles to profit rather than opportunities for positive impact." She glanced at James as she spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Whether this reaction stemmed from discomfort with the implied criticism of his industry or from some other source, she could not determine. "Indeed," Mrs. Worthington agreed, taking a delicate sip of wine, "and that short-sightedness has created numerous problems for our community. James, perhaps you could share your thoughts on the current state of affordable housing initiatives in the downtown area." James shifted in his seat, his grey eyes moving between his mother and Elena, with an expression that suggested he was navigating treacherous waters. "The regulatory requirements have certainly become more complex," he said carefully. "Market pressures make it challenging to balance profitability with community obligations." Elena felt a familiar spark of indignation ignite in her chest. "Market pressures," she repeated, setting her wine glass down with perhaps more force than necessary. "Is that what we're calling the systematic exclusion of working families from decent housing? Market pressures?" "Elena," Mrs. Worthington murmured, but her tone carried approval rather than censure. "Perhaps you could explain your perspective on these market pressures." "Gladly," Elena replied, warming to her subject despite the intimidating surroundings. "The current model treats housing as a commodity rather than a human right. Developers focus on maximizing return on investment, which naturally leads them to build for the highest income brackets. Meanwhile, families earning median wages, teachers, firefighters, nurses, the people who actually make communities function, are systematically priced out of the neighborhoods where they work." James leaned forward slightly, his attention apparently captured despite himself. "But development companies have to answer to investors. We can't simply ignore the economic realities of construction costs and financing requirements." "I'm not suggesting you ignore economic realities," Elena replied, her academic training helping her maintain a measured tone despite her rising passion. "I'm suggesting that those economic models are artificially narrow. They externalize social costs, like the expense of longer commutes, the breakdown of community cohesion, the loss of economic diversity that makes neighborhoods resilient. A truly comprehensive economic analysis would account for the long-term value of mixed-income communities." Mrs. Worthington watched this exchange with the expression of someone observing a particularly engaging chess match. "Elena, you mentioned in your coffee shop speech, which was quite eloquent, by the way, that you've conducted interviews with community leaders. What have they told you about their housing challenges?" Elena felt herself relax slightly as the conversation moved toward her research. The stories are remarkably consistent across different neighborhoods. Families who've lived in communities for generations are being displaced by rising rents. Local businesses lose their customer base as demographics shift. Children have to change schools when their families can no longer afford to live in their districts. The social fabric that makes neighborhoods more than just collections of buildings gets torn apart. She paused, remembering some of the more powerful interviews she had conducted. I spoke with a woman named Maria Gonzalez, who worked as a teacher's aide for 23 years in the same elementary school. She watched 3 generations of families cycle through the neighborhood, helped children learn to read, participated in PTA meetings and community festivals. Then her rent doubled in 2 years, and she had to move 40 miles away. She still makes the commute every day because she can't bear to abandon the children, but she's no longer part of the community she served for more than 2 decades. James had grown quiet during this recitation, his wine glass forgotten as he listened with what appeared to be genuine attention. When Elena finished, he remained silent for several moments before speaking. I hadn't considered the human cost in quite those terms, he admitted, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been discomfort with his own previous perspective. When we analyze development projects, we focus on financial metrics, regulatory compliance, construction timelines. The stories you're describing don't typically enter into our decision-making process because you don't have to see them, Elena replied, surprised by the gentleness that had crept into her own tone. The families who get displaced don't attend the same social events, shop at the same stores, send their children to the same schools. Their struggles remain invisible to the people making the decisions that affect their lives. Mrs. Worthington had been following this exchange with obvious satisfaction, occasionally nodding as if Eleanor's words confirmed some private theory she had been developing. When their food arrived, Eleanor had somehow managed to order something called seasonal vegetables with quinoa, which turned out to be both delicious and artfully arranged. She used the interruption to guide the conversation in a new direction. James, she said, cutting her salmon with precise movements, you mentioned that Worthington Development has been struggling with the affordable housing component of the Riverside project. Perhaps Elena's expertise could prove valuable in addressing those challenges. Elena looked up from her quinoa, suddenly alert. The Riverside project had been mentioned repeatedly in her research. A massive mixed-use development planned for the downtown area that had generated significant community controversy. The Riverside project? I've read about that in the Planning Commission reports. James nodded, though his expression remained guarded. It's been more complex than we initially anticipated. The community input sessions have been spirited. Spirited, Eleanor repeated with a slight smile. I attended one of those sessions. If by spirited, you mean that residents expressed serious concerns about displacement and gentrification, then yes, they were quite spirited. You were there? James asked, surprise evident in his voice. I was conducting research on community engagement in large-scale development projects. Your company's representatives seemed somewhat unprepared for the level of opposition they encountered. Mrs. Worthington set down her fork and regarded her son with an expression that managed to convey both maternal affection and professional disappointment. James, I think it's time we discuss the real reason I wanted to have this lunch. Elena felt a flutter of apprehension. Throughout the meal, she had been gradually relaxing into the conversation, finding herself genuinely engaged by the intellectual challenge of discussing urban development with someone who, despite his privileged background, seemed capable of considering perspectives different from his own. Mrs. Worthington's words, however, carried a weight that suggested the pleasant academic discussion was about to transform into something more consequential. Mother, James began, but she silenced him with a look that Eleanor was beginning to recognize as characteristic. Elena, dear, Mrs. Worthington continued, turning her attention away from her son, I wonder if you've given any thought to what you might do after completing your degree. Have you considered consulting work? I've applied for positions with several non-profit organizations and city planning departments, Elena replied carefully. The academic job market is quite competitive, so I'm trying to keep my options open. And the compensation for such positions would be... Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks. The question of money always made her uncomfortable, particularly in present company, where her financial constraints seemed almost embarrassingly modest. Non-profit work doesn't typically offer high salaries, but the opportunity to make a meaningful impact is worth more than financial compensation. Mrs. Worthington exchanged another of those meaningful looks with her son. Spoken like someone who has never had to choose between making an impact and paying rent, she observed, though her tone carried understanding rather than criticism. What if I told you there might be an opportunity to do both? Elena's pulse quickened. I'm not sure I understand. Worthington Development, Mrs. Worthington explained, has built its reputation on luxury properties and high-end commercial developments. We've been quite successful in financial terms, but I've become increasingly concerned that our success has come at the expense of our responsibility to the broader community. She paused, studying Elena's face as if gauging her reaction. I've been trying to convince James that the company's future depends on embracing a more holistic approach to development, one that considers social impact alongside financial return. Unfortunately, he's been resistant to change. Mother, James interjected, his voice carrying a note of warning. I don't think this is the appropriate venue for... On the contrary, his mother replied smoothly, I think this is exactly the appropriate venue. Elena has demonstrated precisely the kind of vision and passion that Worthington Development needs if it's going to remain relevant in a changing market. Elena found herself staring at Mrs. Worthington, trying to process the implications of her words. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity, the older woman replied. A consulting position that would allow you to complete your thesis while working with Worthington Development to redesign our approach to community engagement and affordable housing integration. The silence that followed this pronouncement was profound. Elena was aware of James watching her intently, though she could not decipher his expression. The offer was simultaneously thrilling and terrifying, exactly the sort of opportunity she had dreamed of, presented under circumstances that seemed almost too surreal to be genuine. The compensation, Mrs. Worthington continued, would be substantially more than you might expect from non-profit work, enough to address any financial concerns you might have about completing your education and beginning your career. Eleanor's mind raced. The practical benefits of such an arrangement were obvious: financial security, professional experience, the chance to influence real development decisions, rather than merely studying them from an academic distance. But something in James's expression suggested that accepting his mother's offer might not be as straightforward as it appeared. Mrs. Worthington, she said carefully, I'm flattered by your confidence in my abilities, but I have to ask, does James share your enthusiasm for this arrangement? Both women turned to look at James, who had been following this exchange with an expression of growing complexity. When he spoke, his voice carried a mixture of resignation and something that might have been reluctant respect. My mother has a talent for identifying unconventional solutions to complex problems, he said, his grey eyes meeting Elena's directly. She's rarely wrong about people, though her methods of bringing them together are sometimes unexpected. That's not exactly an answer, Elena observed. James was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering his words with care. This morning, you accused me of living in a bubble of privilege, of being disconnected from the real impact of my family's business decisions. You weren't wrong. He paused, glancing at his mother before continuing. The Riverside project has been more challenging than any development we've ever undertaken, precisely because of the community opposition you witnessed. Traditional approaches to affordable housing requirements, the minimum necessary to satisfy regulatory compliance, clearly aren't sufficient to address the concerns that have been raised. Elena waited for him to continue, sensing that he was working towards some conclusion that was not yet fully formed in his own mind. "If you were to accept this consulting position," he said finally, "you would have the authority to completely reimagine our approach to community engagement and affordable housing integration. Full access to project budgets, planning documents, financing structures. The power to recommend changes that would prioritize social impact even if they reduce short-term profitability." Elena felt her breath catch. The scope of influence he was describing went far beyond anything she had dared to hope for in her early career. "And you would support such recommendations?" "I would implement them," James replied, his tone carrying a weight that suggested this commitment was not made lightly. "With my mother's backing, you would have the authority to make decisions that I might not have the vision or courage to make independently." Mrs. Worthington was watching this exchange with obvious satisfaction, as if she were witnessing the successful execution of some complex strategy she had been developing for months. "Elena, dear, I hope you'll consider this opportunity seriously. The chance to influence large-scale development decisions from the inside is rare, particularly for someone at the beginning of her career." Elena looked between mother and son, trying to understand the dynamics at play beneath the surface of their polite conversation. There was clearly more to this offer than simple recognition of her academic credentials, some family agenda or personal motivation that she could sense but not fully comprehend. "May I ask," she said slowly, "why this is so important to you? You've built a successful company using traditional approaches. Why risk changing strategies now?" Mrs. Worthington's expression grew serious, the social smile fading to reveal something more genuine and complex. "Eleanor, I am 73 years old. My husband built Worthington Development from nothing, and James will inherit that legacy. But legacies are not merely financial, they are moral. They reflect the values and choices of those who create them." She paused, her gaze moving to the restaurant's large windows, where the city skyline was visible in the distance, a mixture of gleaming towers and older buildings that spoke to decades of development and change. "I look at that skyline," she continued, "and I see my family's contribution to this city's growth. Beautiful buildings, successful projects, substantial profits. But I also see the communities that were displaced, the families that were priced out, the social costs that were externalized in pursuit of maximum return." Her attention returned to Elena, and there was something almost vulnerable in her expression. "I want James to inherit a company that creates value rather than merely extracting it. I want the Worthington name to be associated with development that serves the entire community, not just the wealthy portion of it." Elena found herself deeply moved by the older woman's evident sincerity. The offer was becoming more complex with each revelation, not just a job opportunity, but a chance to participate in what amounted to a family's attempt at moral transformation. "And if I accept," she asked, "what exactly would my role entail?" "Initially," James replied, "you would serve as community liaison and affordable housing specialist for the Riverside project. You would have authority to redesign our community engagement process, recommend changes to the affordable housing component, and work directly with neighborhood groups to address their concerns. The position would be structured as a consulting agreement initially," Mrs. Worthington added, "allowing you flexibility to complete your thesis defense while beginning your work with the company. After graduation, we would discuss the possibility of a permanent position with expanded responsibilities." Elena felt as if she were standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down at a future she could never have imagined that morning. The practical benefits of the opportunity were undeniable, but something deeper was also drawing her, the chance to test her theories in the real world, to discover whether the idealistic vision she had developed through her research could actually influence the kind of large-scale development decisions that shaped entire communities. "I would need to maintain my academic independence," she said finally, If I discover that Worthington Development's practices are harmful to communities, I would need the freedom to say so publicly. Of course, Mrs. Worthington replied immediately. Intellectual honesty is precisely why this arrangement would be valuable. We need someone who will challenge our assumptions, not simply validate our existing approaches. James nodded his agreement, though Eleanor caught a flicker of something, apprehension perhaps, in his expression. The consulting agreement would include full intellectual property rights for any research you conduct. Your academic freedom would be protected. Elena sat back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision before her. 6 hours ago, she had been a graduate student struggling to complete her thesis on a broken laptop. Now she was being offered the opportunity to influence millions of dollars in development decisions, to work directly with one of the region's most powerful development companies, to transform theoretical knowledge into practical change. I would like some time to consider this, she said carefully. Of course, Mrs. Worthington replied graciously, though I hope you won't take too long. The Riverside project timeline is quite aggressive, and the community engagement process needs immediate attention. As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Elena found herself studying James more closely than she had before. Throughout the meal, she had watched him grapple with ideas that seemed to challenge his fundamental assumptions about business and social responsibility. His initial dismissiveness in the coffee shop had given way to something more complex, not complete conversion to her point of view, but at least a willingness to consider perspectives he had not previously encountered. The car ride back to Elena's neighborhood was filled with comfortable conversation about urban planning theory and development economics. Mrs. Worthington demonstrated a surprisingly sophisticated understanding of municipal finance, while James asked questions that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand the social implications of different development approaches. When they reached Elena's apartment building, a modest structure that seemed almost shabby after the afternoon's luxury, Mrs. Worthington pressed a business card into her hand. "My personal number," she explained. "Please don't hesitate to call if you have questions about the position or if you'd like to discuss any aspect of the opportunity in more detail." As Elena stood on the sidewalk watching the car disappear into afternoon traffic, she felt as if she were emerging from some elaborate dream. The morning's confrontation seemed to belong to another lifetime, though the memory of her public outburst still made her cringe with embarrassment. But Mrs. Worthington's offer was real, documented in the elegant business card she held in her hand, and the memory of James's surprisingly thoughtful responses to her questions about community impact and social responsibility. The opportunity represented everything she had hoped to achieve through her academic work. The chance to influence real development decisions, to advocate for communities that typically had no voice in planning processes, to test whether idealistic theories could produce practical change. Yet something about the afternoon's events troubled her in ways she could not fully articulate. The coincidence of Mrs. Worthington's presence at precisely the moment of Elena's public confrontation with James seemed almost too convenient. The older woman's sophisticated understanding of urban development suggested preparation that went beyond casual interest, and James's transformation from dismissive privilege to thoughtful engagement felt almost orchestrated, as if he were performing a role rather than experiencing genuine change. As Elena climbed the stairs to her third-floor apartment, she found herself wondering whether she had been the beneficiary of extraordinary good fortune, or whether she had somehow become an unwitting participant in some more complex family drama whose true nature remained hidden from her understanding. The decision to accept Mrs. Worthington's offer came to Elena not as a moment of sudden clarity, but as the gradual accumulation of practical necessity layered over cautious hope. 3 days of deliberation in her cramped apartment, 3 days during which she had paced the narrow confines of her living space like a caged creature, weighing possibilities against probabilities, had convinced her that the opportunity however mysterious in its origins, represented her best chance of achieving the sort of meaningful impact she had entered academia to pursue. The new laptop had arrived exactly as promised, along with a technician who had managed to recover all of her thesis data from the damaged hard drive. This efficiency alone should have warned her that she was entering a world where problems were solved with a thoroughness that her previous experience had not prepared her to expect. When she called Mrs. Worthington to accept the position, the older woman's satisfaction was evident even through the polite restraint of her response. "Excellent, dear," Mrs. Worthington had said, her voice carrying that distinctive combination of warmth and authority that Elena was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "James will be so pleased. He's been quite anxious to begin the community engagement process, and your participation will make all the difference." Eleanor had wondered even then whether James's anxiety stemmed from eagerness to implement new approaches or from apprehension about working with someone who had publicly challenged his worldview in such dramatic fashion. She was to discover the answer sooner than anticipated. The Worthington development offices occupied 3 floors of a glass tower that rose from the downtown district like a monument to architectural ambition. Elena arrived for her first day of consultation, dressed in her most professional attire, a navy suit purchased during her undergraduate years that had served for job interviews and academic conferences, now pressed into service for an engagement that felt far more consequential than any she had previously undertaken. The reception area spoke of understated wealth, marble floors polished to mirror brightness, furniture that suggested both comfort and substantial cost, art that Elena suspected represented significant investment rather than mere decoration. She announced herself to a receptionist whose professional demeanor and expensive clothing seemed to confirm that Worthington Development paid its employees well enough to maintain appearances consistent with the company's image. James appeared within minutes of her arrival, dressed in another impeccably tailored suit that managed to suggest both authority and accessibility. His greeting was cordial, but carried an undertone of something Elena could not quite identify. Perhaps nervousness, perhaps the sort of careful politeness one employs when dealing with unexploded ordnance. "Elena," he said, extending his hand with a formality that seemed almost theatrical after their previous encounters. "Welcome to Worthington Development. I hope you're ready to dive into the Riverside project. We have quite a bit of ground to cover." She followed him through corridors lined with architectural renderings and photographs of completed developments, each image documenting the company's contribution to the city's transformation over the past 3 decades. The projects ranged from luxury residential towers to upscale shopping centers, all bearing the distinctive mark of substantial investment and sophisticated design. What struck Eleanor most forcefully, however, was not the evident quality of the work, but the absence of any visual acknowledgement of the communities these developments had displaced or transformed. James's office occupied a corner of the building's 23rd floor, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city spreading in all directions. Elena found herself momentarily distracted by the vista. The same urban landscape she had studied through maps and zoning documents now spread before her in 3-dimensional reality, each neighborhood visible as part of a complex whole rather than abstract data points in her research. "Impressive view," she commented, moving toward the windows with the sort of fascination that comes from seeing familiar territory from an entirely new perspective. "It provides useful context for planning decisions," James replied, joining her at the window. "You can see the relationships between different districts, understand how transportation corridors connect communities, observe patterns of development and growth." Elena nodded, though she was struck by how different the city appeared from this elevated vantage point. At ground level, she had experienced the urban environment as a collection of distinct neighborhoods, each with its own character and challenges. From 23 floors above street level, those intimate details dissolved into broader patterns of land use and infrastructure. a perspective that might explain how development decisions could be made with insufficient attention to their human impact. The Riverside project site is visible from here, James continued, pointing toward an area where the city's grid gave way to the meandering line of the river. You can see how the current zoning creates a barrier between the downtown core and the waterfront communities. Elena followed his gaze, noting the clear division between the gleaming towers of the business district and the lower-rise buildings that stretched toward the river. The contrast was stark: prosperity and investment on one side, older structures and what appeared to be vacant lots on the other. Those waterfront communities, she said, have been home to working families for generations. The zoning you're describing as a barrier might also be seen as protection against exactly the sort of displacement that large-scale development typically produces. James turned from the window to study her face, his expression suggesting he was recalibrating his approach based on her response. That's precisely the perspective we need to understand better. The community opposition to our initial proposals has been substantial. Have you read the transcripts from the Planning Commission hearings? Eleanor asked. I've reviewed the summaries prepared by our legal team, James replied, a note of something that might have been embarrassment creeping into his voice. Elena felt a familiar spark of academic indignation. Summaries prepared by lawyers are unlikely to capture the actual concerns being raised by residents. Legal perspectives focus on regulatory compliance and liability management. They don't necessarily reflect the social and economic realities that community members are trying to articulate. She moved away from the window and settled into one of the chairs, arranged around James's conference table, pulling her laptop from the bag she had brought with her. I've analyzed every public comment from the past 6 months of hearings. The patterns are quite clear once you look beyond the legal framing. James took the chair across from her, his attention apparently focused on her laptop screen as she opened the relevant files. What patterns? 3 primary concerns, Elena replied, her academic training taking over as she organized her thoughts. First, displacement anxiety. Residents understand that development typically leads to rising property values and rents, which forces out families who can't afford the increases. Second, cultural preservation. These communities have established social networks, local businesses, community institutions that provide both economic and social stability. Large-scale development disrupts these networks even when it doesn't directly displace residents. Third, democratic participation. Residents feel that development decisions are made without meaningful input from the people who will be most affected by them. She looked up from her screen to find James watching her with an expression she had not seen before, something that looked almost like concentration, as if he were trying to memorize her words. Those concerns seem reasonable, he said slowly. They are reasonable, Elena replied, perhaps more sharply than she had intended. The question is whether Worthington Development is prepared to address them seriously, or whether you're looking for someone to help you manage community opposition more effectively. The silence that followed her question stretched long enough to become uncomfortable. James seemed to be weighing his response with unusual care, as if her words had forced him to confront some internal contradiction he had not previously acknowledged. Honestly, he said finally, I'm not certain I know the difference. Eleanor felt a flicker of something she had not expected, sympathy for James's apparent confusion. His admission suggested a level of self-awareness that was at odds with her initial assessment of his character, though it also revealed how ill-equipped he was to navigate the complex social dynamics his company's projects created. The difference, she explained, moderating her tone, is between authentic engagement and strategic manipulation. Authentic engagement means being willing to modify your plans based on community input, even if those modifications reduce profitability. Strategic manipulation means using community input to identify the minimum changes necessary to reduce opposition without fundamentally altering your approach. James leaned back in his chair, his gaze moving between Elena and the city vista beyond his windows. And you believe most development companies practice strategic manipulation? I believe most development companies are structured to maximize return on investment for their shareholders, Elena replied. Community concerns become relevant only insofar as they represent obstacles to profit generation. That's not necessarily a moral failing. It's a systemic issue created by the way we organize economic activity. She paused, considering how to frame her next point without sounding accusatory. The question is whether Worthington Development is prepared to experiment with a different approach, one that treats community benefit as an end in itself rather than merely a means to regulatory compliance. That's what my mother believes we should do, James said, though his tone suggested he was still wrestling with the implications of such a shift. What do you believe? The question seemed to catch him off guard. Eleanor watched as he struggled to formulate a response, his usual confidence replaced by something that looked almost like vulnerability. I believe, he said slowly, that I've spent most of my career making decisions based on financial projections and market analysis without giving adequate consideration to their broader impact. This morning, I reviewed the community meeting transcripts you mentioned, not the legal summaries, but the actual transcripts. He stood and moved back toward the window, as if the city view might provide clarity for the thoughts he was trying to express. The residents who spoke at those hearings weren't opposing development because they're anti-progress or anti-business. They were trying to protect something valuable that they were afraid of losing. Elena felt a shift in the emotional temperature of their conversation. James's acknowledgement represented the sort of breakthrough she had hoped for, but had not dared to expect so quickly. That's exactly right, she said. Community opposition to development is rarely ideological. It's practical. People are trying to preserve the social and economic relationships that make their neighborhoods function as communities, rather than merely collections of individual housing units. James turned from the window, his expression more serious than she had yet seen it. So if we were to approach the Riverside project from that perspective, prioritizing community preservation alongside development goals, what would that look like in practical terms? Elena felt her pulse quicken. The question suggested that James was prepared to move beyond theoretical discussion toward concrete planning, which was exactly the sort of engagement she had hoped this consulting arrangement might provide. It would start with genuine community partnership, she replied, not public hearings where residents are allowed to comment on predetermined plans, but collaborative planning sessions where community members participate in identifying priorities and designing solutions. She opened another file on her laptop, pulling up a presentation she had developed during her graduate research. There are models for this kind of partnership: community land trusts, cooperative development agreements, shared equity programs that allow long-term residents to benefit from rising property values rather than being displaced by them. James moved closer to examine her screen, his interest apparently genuine. These models, have they been implemented successfully in projects comparable to Riverside? Several examples exist, though they're still relatively uncommon, Elena replied, clicking through slides that documented case studies from other cities. The financial returns are typically lower than traditional development approaches, at least in the short term. But the long-term benefits, community stability, reduced infrastructure costs, sustained local economic activity, often justify the initial investment. Reduced infrastructure costs. Elena smiled, recognizing the moment when theoretical discussion began connecting with practical business concerns. Stable communities require less ongoing investment in social services, public safety, education support systems. When development displaces established residents, those costs shift to other neighborhoods or require increased public expenditure. Community-preserving development internalizes those benefits rather than externalizing the costs. James studied the case studies she had displayed, occasionally asking questions that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand both the social theory and the economic mechanics involved. Elena found herself impressed by the quality of his attention. When he focused on a problem, he seemed capable of grasping both its complexity and its practical implications. Their discussion was interrupted by a knock on the office door, followed by the entrance of an older man whom Elena did not recognize. He was perhaps 55, impeccably dressed in the manner she was beginning to associate with senior executives, his bearing suggesting both authority and the sort of confidence that comes from decades of successful decision-making. "James," the man said, his tone carrying the casual intimacy of long familiarity, "I hope I'm not interrupting, but we need to discuss the timeline for the Riverside financing arrangements." James rose from his chair with an expression that seemed to mix respect and wariness. "Robert, I'd like you to meet Elena Hartwell, the consultant I mentioned. Elena, this is Robert Morrison, Worthington Development's Chief Financial Officer and my father's former business partner." Elena stood to accept Morrison's handshake, noting the way his eyes quickly assessed her appearance and demeanor with the sort of rapid evaluation she imagined he applied to potential investments. His smile was professionally cordial, but she detected something cooler beneath its surface. "Miss Hartwell," Morrison said, his tone pleasant, but somehow conveying skepticism. "James mentioned that you would be providing guidance on community engagement strategies. I understand you have academic expertise in urban planning?" "That's correct," Elena replied, maintaining eye contact despite her growing sense that Morrison viewed her presence as problematic rather than beneficial. "How interesting," Morrison continued, his tone suggesting that he found it anything but interesting. "I don't believe we've previously worked with academic consultants on our development projects. Our community relations have typically been handled by our legal and public affairs teams." Elena glanced at James, noting the tension that had entered his posture since Morrison's arrival. "Mr. Morrison," she said carefully, "I think the challenges with the Riverside project suggest that traditional approaches to community relations may not be sufficient for this particular situation." Morrison's smile sharpened. "The challenges with Riverside stem from unrealistic community expectations and coordinated opposition from anti-development activists. What we need is more effective messaging, not fundamental changes to our development approach." Elena felt the familiar heat of academic indignation begin to rise in her chest. Morrison's dismissal of community concerns as unrealistic expectations and coordinated opposition represented exactly the sort of attitude that made meaningful engagement impossible. "With respect, Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying the sort of measured precision she had learned to employ in academic debates. Characterizing community concerns as unrealistic or activist-driven misses the substantive issues that residents are raising about displacement, economic impact, and democratic participation in planning processes. Morrison's expression shifted, the professional courtesy giving way to something more direct. "Miss Hartwell, Worthington Development has successfully completed dozens of projects over the past 30 years. Our approach works because it's based on financial realities and regulatory requirements rather than theoretical ideals." "Your approach works for generating profit," Elena replied, her academic training helping her maintain composure despite Morrison's obvious condescension. "But the Riverside project demonstrates that it may not work for generating community acceptance, which is increasingly necessary for regulatory approval and long-term project success." James had been observing this exchange with an expression of growing discomfort, clearly caught between his respect for Morrison's experience and his apparent interest in exploring the alternative approaches Elena represented. "Robert," he interjected, "I think Elena's perspective could help us understand why the Riverside community engagement has been more difficult than anticipated. The opposition we're facing seems to go beyond typical NIMBY concerns." Morrison turned his attention to James with an expression that managed to convey both paternal authority and professional impatience. "James, community opposition is always emotionally charged, regardless of the underlying issues. Our job is to maintain focus on project viability and regulatory compliance, not to get distracted by every concern raised by residents who don't understand the complexities of development economics. Elena felt her composure finally beginning to slip. Morrison's casual dismissal of community concerns as emotionally charged distractions represented everything she had come to despise about traditional development approaches. The assumption that expertise resided exclusively with developers and their consultants, that community members were obstacles to be managed rather than stakeholders to be engaged. "Mr. Morrison," she said, her voice carrying an edge she had not entirely intended, "the residents raising concerns about the Riverside project include teachers, nurses, small business owners, and community leaders who have spent decades building the social and economic networks that make neighborhoods function. Their concerns aren't emotional distractions. They're informed perspectives on how development decisions affect community sustainability." Morrison's smile disappeared entirely. "Miss Hartwell, community sustainability is a luxury that becomes relevant after projects achieve financial viability. Our primary responsibility is to our investors, who expect returns based on proven development approaches rather than experimental social programs. And if those proven development approaches generate community opposition that delays or prevents project completion," Elena challenged. "If regulatory approval becomes impossible because residents successfully argue that the project will cause more harm than benefit, what happens to investor returns then?" The silence that followed her question was profound. Morrison stared at her with an expression that suggested he was recalibrating his assessment of both her capabilities and her potential threat to his preferred approach to the Riverside project. James looked between them with obvious discomfort, apparently recognizing that the conversation had moved beyond academic discussion towards something more consequential. It was Morrison who broke the silence, his tone carrying a precision that Elena interpreted as barely controlled anger. "Miss Hartwell, I'm not certain you fully understand the constraints within which real estate development operates. Community engagement is valuable insofar as it facilitates project approval and completion, but it cannot be allowed to compromise fundamental project economics." "I understand the constraints perfectly," Elena replied, her academic training allowing her to match his tone of professional authority. "What I'm questioning is whether those constraints are as fixed as you assume they are, and whether approaches that prioritize community benefit alongside financial return might actually improve long-term project outcomes." Morrison turned to James with an expression that seemed to demand some declaration of loyalty or position. "James, I think we need to clarify the scope and authority of Miss Hartwell's consulting arrangement. If she's going to recommend changes to fundamental project parameters, those recommendations need to be evaluated against established business practices and investor expectations." Elena felt the moment balanced on the edge of something significant, a test, perhaps, of whether James would support the experimental approach his mother had advocated or defer to the traditional methods Morrison represented. She found herself holding her breath, waiting to discover which direction the conversation and her consulting arrangement would ultimately take. James looked between Morrison and Elena for what seemed like an eternity before responding, his voice carrying a firmness she had not previously heard from him. "Robert," he said, "I think Elena's questions are exactly the ones we need to be asking if we're going to move forward successfully with Riverside. The community opposition we're facing suggests that our traditional approaches may need modification, regardless of how successful they've been in the past." Morrison's expression darkened, but before he could respond, James continued, "I've asked Elena to conduct a comprehensive review of our community engagement strategy and to recommend modifications that might improve both community acceptance and project outcomes. Her recommendations will be evaluated on their merits, including their potential impact on project economics." Eleanor felt a surge of something she had not expected, gratitude mixed with respect for James's willingness to support an approach that clearly made his senior executive uncomfortable. The moment felt significant beyond its immediate context, as if it represented some fundamental choice about the direction Worthington Development would pursue in addressing the complex challenges of contemporary urban development. The weeks that followed Elena's confrontation with Robert Morrison unfolded with the sort of intensity that comes when theoretical principles encounter practical application under the scrutiny of substantial financial stakes. Elena threw herself into the Riverside project with the fervor of someone who recognized that she was being given an opportunity to test every conviction she had developed during her academic career. The community engagement process she designed represented a radical departure from Worthington Development's traditional approach. Instead of public hearings where residents could comment on predetermined plans, she organized collaborative workshops where community members participated directly in identifying priorities and designing solutions. The response from the Riverside neighborhood exceeded even Elena's optimistic projections. Maria Gonzalez, the displaced teacher's aide, whose story had so moved Elena during her research, became one of the project's most passionate advocates when she learned that the development would include affordable units specifically reserved for community members who had been priced out of the neighborhood. Local business owners, initially suspicious of any development that might threaten their customer base, began to see opportunities for expansion when Elena's workshops revealed the potential for increased foot traffic and economic activity. James proved to be a more capable partner than Elena had dared to hope. His initial awkwardness with community engagement gave way to genuine curiosity about the concerns residents raised, and his business training allowed him to identify creative financing mechanisms that could accommodate community priorities without completely abandoning profitability considerations. Elena watched with fascination as he navigated conversations with neighborhood leaders, gradually learning to listen for the substance beneath emotional expressions of concern or opposition. The transformation was perhaps most evident during a particularly challenging workshop session, where long-time residents confronted the painful reality that some degree of neighborhood change was inevitable, regardless of the specific development approach ultimately adopted. Elena observed James as he listened to an elderly man describe watching his community gradually lose its character to rising rents and demographic shifts, noting the way James's initial discomfort evolved into something approaching genuine empathy. "Mr. Patterson," James had said, his voice carrying none of the professional distance that had characterized his early community interactions, "I can't promise that development won't bring changes to your neighborhood, but I can promise that we'll structure this project to ensure that long-term residents like yourself benefit from those changes rather than being displaced by them." Eleanor had felt something shift in her assessment of James during that exchange. The man who had dismissed her laptop disaster with casual indifference was clearly capable of growth, of developing the sort of moral imagination that effective community engagement required. She began to understand why Mrs. Worthington had seen potential in her son that he had not yet recognized in himself. But it was during a private dinner at the Worthington family home that Eleanor finally began to comprehend the full complexity of the situation into which she had been drawn. Mrs. Worthington had extended the invitation with the sort of gracious insistence that Elena was learning to recognize as characteristic, phrased as a social courtesy, but carrying the weight of expectation that made refusal practically impossible. The Worthington residence occupied several acres in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, its Georgian architecture and meticulously maintained grounds suggesting the sort of generational wealth that shaped families as much as bank accounts. Elena arrived wearing her most formal dress, a simple black garment that had served for academic conferences and remained her only truly elegant option. acutely conscious of entering a world where her background provided no guidance for appropriate behavior. Mrs. Worthington greeted her with the warmth she had come to expect, but Eleanor detected something different in the older woman's demeanor, a sense of anticipation that suggested the evening held significance beyond mere social courtesy. James was already present, dressed in casual clothing that nonetheless managed to suggest both comfort and considerable expense. His manner more relaxed than Elena had yet observed in professional settings. The dinner itself was served by staff whose invisible efficiency spoke to years of training and substantial compensation. The conversation ranging across topics that revealed the breadth of Mrs. Worthington's intellectual interests and social connections. Elena found herself discussing everything from municipal finance theory to contemporary literature, gradually relaxing as she realized that her hosts were genuinely interested in her perspectives rather than merely fulfilling social obligations. It was during the wine service, a vintage that Elena suspected was worth more than her monthly rent, that Mrs. Worthington finally revealed the evening's underlying purpose. "Elena, dear," she said, her tone carrying the sort of casual significance that Elena had learned to recognize as dangerous. "I've been following your work on the Riverside project with great interest. James tells me the community response has been extraordinary." Eleanor glanced at James, noting a tension in his posture that suggested he was as uncertain about his mother's intentions as she was. "The collaborative approach has been more successful than I anticipated," she replied carefully. "Community members seem genuinely excited about the possibility of development that serves their interests rather than displacing them." "Indeed," Mrs. Worthington agreed, taking a delicate sip of wine, "and James seems to have developed quite an appreciation for your innovative methods." Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks as she recognized the direction the conversation was taking. Throughout their weeks of collaboration, she had become increasingly aware of James as something more than a professional colleague. His thoughtful questions, his growing sensitivity to community concerns, his obvious struggle to reconcile his privileged background with the social realities her work had forced him to confront, all contributed to a complexity that she found unexpectedly attractive. But she had attributed her growing feelings to the satisfaction of seeing someone genuinely change in response to new ideas. The professional pleasure of successful collaboration, nothing more consequential than that. The possibility that Mrs. Worthington had observed something deeper in their interactions was both thrilling and terrifying. "Mother," James said, his voice carrying a warning note, "I don't think—" "Nonsense, Mrs." Worthington replied with the sort of maternal authority that brooked no contradiction. "Eleanor is clearly having a profound influence on your thinking, both professionally and personally. I can hardly be expected to ignore such obvious developments." Eleanor found herself staring at her wine glass, uncertain how to respond to such direct acknowledgement of feelings she had barely admitted to herself. The situation felt surreal. She was being discussed as if she were not present, her romantic potential evaluated by a woman who had orchestrated their introduction under circumstances that now seemed far more calculated than coincidental. "Mrs. Worthington," she said finally, raising her eyes to meet the older woman's expectant gaze, "I'm not sure I understand what you're suggesting." Mrs. Worthington's smile carried satisfaction mixed with something that might have been maternal pride. "Elena, dear, I'm suggesting that you and James have developed exactly the sort of partnership I had hoped to see. Professional collaboration based on shared values and mutual respect, with the potential for something deeper if you're both wise enough to recognize it." The silence that followed this declaration stretched until it became almost unbearable. Elena looked between mother and son, trying to understand the dynamics at play beneath the surface of what had appeared to be a simple family dinner. James seemed as stunned by his mother's directness as Elena felt, though his expression suggested that the idea itself was not entirely unwelcome. "Margaret Worthington," Elena said slowly, using the older woman's full name with deliberate formality, Did you orchestrate our meeting in the coffee shop? Mrs. Worthington's expression shifted to something approaching sheepishness, though her essential composure remained intact. I may have been aware that James frequented that particular establishment at that particular time of day, and I may have suggested you might find it a suitable location for working on your thesis. Elena felt a complex mixture of emotions: anger at being manipulated, admiration for the sophistication of the manipulation, and a growing understanding that Mrs. Worthington's matchmaking had been motivated by considerations that went far beyond romantic sentiment. "You read my thesis proposal," Elena continued, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to align in her mind. "You knew exactly what sort of person I was, what sort of values I represented, before you ever met me. I knew that you possessed the intellectual rigor and moral courage that Worthington development needed if it was going to evolve beyond its current limitations," Mrs. Worthington replied without apparent embarrassment. "I also suspected that you might provide exactly the sort of challenge and inspiration that James needed to develop his full potential as both a businessman and a human being." James finally found his voice, though it carried a note of something between amazement and exasperation. "Mother, you can't simply decide that two people should fall in love and then manipulate circumstances to make it happen." "I can certainly create opportunities," Mrs. Worthington replied with dignity. "What develops from those opportunities depends entirely on the people involved." Eleanor stood from the table, needing movement to process the extraordinary revelation that her entire professional opportunity had been designed as an elaborate matchmaking scheme. The Worthington dining room suddenly felt claustrophobic, its elegant proportions and valuable furnishings seeming to close around her like the elements of an elaborate trap. "Elena," James said, rising to follow her toward the large windows that overlooked the estate's formal gardens. "Please don't judge my mother too harshly. Her methods are sometimes unconventional, but her motives are genuine." Eleanor turned to face him, struck by the complexity of her own emotions. The professional respect she had developed for James over the past weeks remained unchanged, but it was now complicated by the knowledge that their collaboration had been engineered by his mother's careful orchestration. Even more confusing was her realization that her growing personal feelings for James seemed to exist independently of the circumstances that had brought them together. "James," she said, her voice quieter than she had intended, "how can I know what's real between us and what's the result of your mother's manipulation?" He moved closer, close enough that she could see the genuine uncertainty in his gray eyes. "Because manipulation can create opportunities, but it can't create feelings. Whatever has developed between us, professionally and personally, happened because of who we are, not because of my mother's plans." Elena studied his face, searching for evidence of sincerity or deception. What she found was something more complex. A man struggling to understand his own emotions while dealing with the realization that his mother had been orchestrating events he had attributed to chance or natural development. "And what has developed between us?" she asked, the question carrying more weight than she had intended. James was quiet for a long moment, apparently considering not just his response, but the implications of whatever response he chose to make. When he spoke, his voice carried the sort of careful honesty she had learned to associate with his most thoughtful moments. "I've spent the past month working with someone who challenges everything I thought I understood about business, about social responsibility, about the impact of the choices I make every day," he said. "You've forced me to see my work and my world through different eyes, and I've discovered that I like the person I become when I'm trying to live up to your expectations." Elena felt her pulse quicken at his words, recognizing in them an echo of her own experience. Working with James had revealed capacities for practical application of her ideals that she had not known she possessed, had shown her that the gap between theory and practice was not as unbridgeable as she had feared. "Beyond that," James continued, his voice dropping to a tone that carried intimacy despite the formal setting, I've found myself thinking about you in ways that have nothing to do with the Riverside project or my mother's plans. When I watch you facilitate community workshops, when you get passionate about affordable housing policy, when you challenge assumptions that everyone else simply accepts, you become the most compelling person in any room. Elena felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine they had been drinking. Despite the elaborate orchestration that had brought them together, despite the complex family dynamics and professional considerations that surrounded their relationship, James's words carried a quality of genuine feeling that she trusted. "Your mother," she said, glancing back toward the dining room where Mrs. Worthington remained seated with the patient expression of someone confident in the outcome of events she had set in motion, "is an extraordinarily manipulative woman." "Yes," James agreed readily. "She's also usually right about people and their potential for growth and happiness." Eleanor found herself laughing despite the complexity of her emotions. "And you don't mind being manipulated?" "I mind being manipulated without my knowledge," James replied, his tone becoming more serious. "But if the result is meeting someone who makes me want to become a better person, who challenges me to use my advantages for something more meaningful than profit generation, who makes me feel like the work I do might actually matter, then I'm grateful for the manipulation." Mrs. Worthington's voice carried from the dining room, where she had apparently been listening to their conversation with the sort of shameless interest that Eleanor was beginning to recognize as characteristic. "Are you two quite finished with your private conference? I believe dessert is being served, and I have champagne that I've been saving for a special occasion." Eleanor looked at James, noting the mixture of embarrassment and affection with which he regarded his mother's behavior. She really did plan all of this, didn't she? The coffee shop encounter, the job offer, this dinner, everything. "I'm beginning to suspect she's been planning this for months," James admitted. "Possibly since she first read about your research and decided you represented everything she thought I needed to encounter." Eleanor felt another wave of complex emotions. Irritation at being treated as a pawn in someone else's game, admiration for the sophistication of Mrs. Worthington's planning, and a growing appreciation for the older woman's genuine concern for her son's personal and moral development. "And how do you feel about being the subject of such extensive maternal interference?" she asked. James considered the question with the sort of careful attention he had learned to bring to complex problems. "I feel like my mother understands things about what I need that I haven't been wise enough to recognize myself, and I feel like protesting her methods would be rather hypocritical, given that they've brought me exactly what I never knew I was looking for." Elena found herself moving closer to James, drawn by the honesty in his voice and the growing certainty that whatever had developed between them transcended the circumstances of its origin. "And what were you looking for?" "Someone who would see possibilities I couldn't imagine," James replied, his voice carrying the sort of intensity that made Elena acutely aware of the narrowing space between them. "Someone who would care enough about things that matter to risk arguing with me in public. Someone who would make me want to deserve the advantages I've been given." Elena felt her breath catch as she recognized in his words a description not just of what he had been seeking, but of what she had been seeking as well. Someone who would take her ideals seriously enough to help her transform them into practical change, who would provide the resources and support necessary to make a real impact, who would see her passion for justice as strength rather than naivety. "Elena," James said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "my mother may have orchestrated our meeting, but she can't orchestrate what happens next. That's something only we can decide." Elena looked into his grey eyes, seeing there the same complexity of feeling she recognized in herself: professional respect, layered over personal attraction, shared values, creating the foundation for something deeper, the possibility of partnership that might transform them both into better versions of themselves. "What do you think should happen next?" she asked, the question carrying implications that extended far beyond the immediate moment. James's response came not in words, but in the gentle pressure of his hand against her cheek, the careful movement as he leaned closer, the question in his eyes that asked permission for what they both knew was about to occur. Elena's answer was the elimination of the final inches between them, the acceptance of the kiss that seemed to represent not just personal attraction, but the acknowledgement of a partnership that might prove more transformative than either had dared to hope. From the dining room came the sound of champagne being opened, followed by Mrs. Worthington's voice, carrying satisfaction and maternal triumph. "I do believe the evening is proceeding exactly as planned," she announced to no one in particular, though Elena suspected the comment was intended for their ears. As James's arms encircled her, Eleanor found herself thinking that she had begun the day by screaming at the wrong millionaire and was ending it by kissing the right one, though the distinction had less to do with wealth than with the capacity for growth, the willingness to be changed by love, and the courage to use privilege in service of justice. The Riverside project would go on to become a model for community-centered development, attracting attention from urban planners and social justice advocates across the country. Elena would complete her thesis with distinction and accept a permanent position with Worthington Development, eventually transforming the company into one of the region's most innovative and socially responsible development firms. But all of that lay in the future. In the present moment, Elena was content to be held by someone who had learned to see the world through her eyes, while his extraordinarily manipulative mother opened champagne in celebration of a plan that had succeeded beyond even her considerable expectations. Sometimes, Elena reflected, the most important transformations begin with the courage to speak truth to power, even when, especially when, that power turns out to belong to exactly the right person.